a Mahayana Buddhist reflection on the Nativity of Christ, Common Ground, Divergent Paths of Liberation, and the Mythos of the Virgin Birth by the Backyard Buddhist. As the Christian liturgical calendar turns toward the Feast of the Nativity, the image of the Christ child returns once again to the spiritual imagination of millions of people. A newborn child, fragile, luminous, vulnerable, held in the arms of his mother, surrounded, according to the traditional story, by animals, shepherds, angels, and those who've traveled a great distance simply to bow before him. For those of us who practice Zen, or who belong to one of the broader Mahayana Buddhist traditions, the Nativity offers an interesting opportunity for reflection. I'm not suggesting that Buddhists should appropriate the Christian story. I'm not suggesting that we should take Christian teachings and simply translate them into Buddhist language. And I'm certainly not suggesting that Buddhism and Christianity are somehow the same religion wearing different cultural clothing. They aren't. They're distinct traditions. They begin with different assumptions about the nature of reality, the human condition, and the means by which human beings are liberated from suffering. But that doesn't mean they can't speak to one another. Thinkers such as Masao Abe, Thich Nhat Hanh, Heinrich Dumoulin, and D.T. Suzuki have shown that an encounter between Buddhist teachings and Christian imagery can deepen our understanding of both traditions. So in that spirit, I'd like to reflect on the birth of Jesus through a Zen and Mahayana Buddhist lens. I'm not approaching the Nativity as a doctrine that Buddhists must either accept or reject. Instead, I'm approaching it as a profound religious narrative. It's a story that points toward vulnerability, awakening, compassion, and the mystery of love taking form in the world. The Nativity as sacred mythos. When we hear the word myth, we often assume that it means something false. We say that's only a myth, as though a myth were nothing more than a mistaken account of historical events. But that isn't the way scholars of religion generally use the word. Mircea Eliade, for example, used the term myth to describe a sacred narrative that communicates existential or spiritual truth. A myth may contain historical elements. It may also contain poetry, symbolism, theology, memory, and imagination. Its deepest purpose isn't merely to tell us what happened. It's meant to show us what an event means. The Christian stories surrounding the birth of Jesus are found primarily in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. These accounts were written decades after the death of Jesus, and they aren't identical. Each Gospel writer shapes the story according to the theological needs and spiritual understanding of the community for which he was writing. Yet both accounts make a central proclamation. The sacred enters the world through vulnerability. God doesn't appear as a conquering emperor. God doesn't arrive surrounded by military power, wealth, or political prestige. God appears as a child who's dependent upon others, a child born into uncertainty, a child whose family will soon be forced to confront danger, displacement, and fear. Whether one receives this as literal history, theological proclamation, or sacred mythos, the spiritual message is striking. What Christians call divine love enters the world without armor. It arrives without protection. It comes to us in a form that can be held, fed, comforted, and harmed. Mahayana Buddhism isn't unfamiliar with miraculous or highly symbolic birth narratives. The traditional accounts of the Buddha's birth describe Queen Maya giving birth from her side. The infant Buddha is surrounded by celestial signs, prophecies, and supernatural events. In the Lalitavistara Sutra, the birth of Siddhartha Gautama isn't presented merely as an ordinary biological event. It's portrayed as a cosmic turning point. The entire universe seems to recognize that something of immeasurable importance has occurred. In the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, is described as appearing in whatever form is needed to liberate suffering beings. Avalokiteshvara may appear as a monk, a layperson, a ruler, a child, a celestial being, or an ordinary human being. Compassion doesn't remain confined to one fixed identity. It takes the form that circumstances require. The Nirvana Sutra speaks in another way of the birthless birth, of the Tathagata. A Buddha isn't ultimately defined by biological origin. Buddhahood arises from timeless wisdom. It isn't owned by a personality, a family, or a particular moment in history. These Buddhist stories function in ways that are similar to the Christian nativity narratives. They use extraordinary language to reveal what ordinary language can't fully express. They aren't simply trying to provide medical or historical accounts of childbirth. They're telling us that awakening has appeared. Compassion has taken form. A new possibility has entered the human world. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote in Living Buddha, Living Christ, "When we touch deeply the story of Jesus' birth, we touch the great wonder of life itself. This is a truth that goes beyond all ideas about history." For me, this is an important observation. When we encounter a sacred story, we don't always have to begin by asking, did this happen exactly as it's described? We might first ask, what is this story revealing? What movement of the heart is it inviting? What transformation is it calling forth within us? From a Buddhist perspective, the Nativity can be approached as a form of upaya, skillful means. It's a sacred narrative that points beyond itself. It points toward a transformation of consciousness and a life shaped by compassion. Virgin birth and the nature of awakening. For traditional Christianity, the virgin birth isn't merely a symbol. It's an affirmation about the identity of Jesus. It declares that Jesus isn't simply a wise teacher, prophet, or moral reformer. He is understood as the incarnation of the divine Logos, the Word of God spoken of in the opening chapter of the Gospel of John. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. For Christians, the virgin birth belongs to this larger proclamation. The divine enters human history in a unique and decisive way. Buddhists approach such claims differently. That doesn't necessarily mean that we approach them with hostility or contempt. It means that we begin with a different understanding of reality. Buddhism is generally described as non-theistic. But non-theistic doesn't necessarily mean atheistic. Buddhism doesn't require belief in a creator God. It doesn't teach that the universe depends upon the will of a supreme personal being. Yet traditional Buddhist cosmology contains devas, celestial beings, bodhisattvas, innumerable world systems, miraculous manifestations, and realms of existence far beyond ordinary human perception. The Avatamsaka Sutra, for example, describes a universe containing countless worlds, Buddhas, and bodhisattvas. These beings appear in forms suited to the needs of those they're helping. So the central Buddhist question isn't necessarily whether extraordinary manifestations are possible. The deeper question is how we understand the nature of those manifestations. Are they separate from us? Are they permanent? Do they possess an independent essence? Or do they arise through the same boundless web of interdependence that gives rise to everything else? Long pause. From a Mahayana perspective, the virgin birth can be contemplated symbolically. It can represent the unconditioned arising of wisdom and compassion. It can point toward a birth that isn't determined by ego, social identity, personal ambition, or inherited conditioning. In Zen, we sometimes speak of the true person who isn't born from mother and father. This doesn't deny our biological existence. It points towards something deeper than our personal history. Before we were given a name, before we learned to defend an identity, before we divided the world into self and other, what were we? Zen master Hakuin spoke of the true person of no rank, the person who isn't confined by social position, fixed identity, or conceptual limitation. This true person isn't born in the ordinary sense. It isn't created by our opinions about ourselves. It isn't produced by our successes or destroyed by our failures. It's the living reality that appears when attachment to a fixed self falls away. Nagarjuna's teaching in the Mula Madhyamaka Karika shows us that nothing arises from an independent, permanent essence. Things don't arise entirely from themselves. They don't arise entirely from something else. They don't arise from both, and they don't arise without conditions. Everything exists relationally. Everything appears through dependent co-arising. So, from a Zen perspective, We might say that the virgin birth symbolizes the groundlessness of awakening. Awakening doesn't emerge from an eternal ego. It doesn't belong to a permanent soul. It doesn't arise because the self has perfected itself. It appears when the illusion of a separate, independent self is seen through. It emerges from emptiness, shunyata. We might also say that the birth of Jesus represents the uncontaminated nature of compassion. Compassion is virgin when it's free from egoic grasping. It doesn't ask, what will I receive in return? It doesn't calculate whether another person deserves kindness. It doesn't exist to reinforce an image of ourselves as virtuous or spiritual. True compassion arises freely. It responds because suffering is present. Long pause. The Nativity may also point toward the universal potential for bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is the mind of awakening. It's the deep aspiration to awaken for the sake of all beings. It's the moment when our practice ceases to be only about our own peace, our own healing, or our own liberation. Something greater is born within us. We begin to see that my suffering can't be separated from your suffering. My awakening can't be separated from your awakening. My life belongs to the whole web of life. These Buddhist interpretations wouldn't be considered orthodox Christian theology. We should be honest about that. But they can still represent a respectful Buddhist engagement with Christian symbolism. We don't have to claim that the Christian story secretly teaches Buddhism. We can simply allow the story to speak to us from within its own tradition, while listening with Buddhist ears. Long pause. Two different understandings of salvation. This brings us to the place where Buddhism and Christianity diverge most clearly. They don't describe the fundamental human problem in the same way, and because they diagnose the problem differently, they don't prescribe the same solution. In classical Christianity, the world is understood as fallen. Humanity has become alienated from God through sin. Human beings can't fully repair this separation through their own efforts. God therefore becomes incarnate in Jesus Christ. Through the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, humanity is reconciled to God. This is a relational and theistic model of salvation. God acts, God enters history, God restores a broken relationship. The Nativity is the beginning of that redemptive drama. The child in the manger is already understood in light of the cross and resurrection. Mahayana Buddhism begins elsewhere. Buddhism teaches that beings suffer because of ignorance, avidya. We misunderstand the nature of reality. We imagine ourselves to be permanent, separate, and independent. We cling to experiences that can't remain. We resist experiences that can't be avoided. And from this ignorance arise greed, hatred, and countless forms of suffering. Liberation doesn't come through reconciliation with a creator God. It arises through wisdom and compassion. We awaken to emptiness. We see dependent origination. We recognize that the self we've been defending so fiercely has never existed in the fixed and isolated way we imagined. No external savior enters samsara and repairs it on our behalf. Buddhas and bodhisattvas guide us, they teach us, they encourage us. They may even carry us when we're unable to walk alone, but they don't erase the need for realization. They can point toward the moon, but we still have to look. They can open the gate, but we still have to pass through it. From this perspective, the Buddha's birth isn't an intervention by a being standing outside the universe. It's the manifestation of awakened potential within the universe. It reveals what human beings can realize. The Buddha awakens not because he's rescued from humanity, but because he sees humanity and all reality as it actually is. So there's a genuine difference here. Christian salvation is traditionally centered upon what God accomplishes through Christ. Buddhist liberation is centered upon awakening from ignorance through wisdom, ethical conduct, meditation, and compassion. We shouldn't erase that distinction. Real dialogue doesn't require pretending that differences don't exist. In fact, honest dialogue depends upon recognizing them. The meeting point of compassion. Even with these differences, there's a profound point of contact. Both traditions proclaim that compassion must enter the world. Compassion can't remain an abstract ideal. It must take form. It must acquire hands, feet, eyes, and a voice. It must become embodied. Thich Nhat Hanh sometimes described Jesus as a bodhisattva of great understanding and love. He wrote, "If we can understand Jesus in the light of the Dharma, we can love him and honor him in a way that doesn't conflict with our Buddhist roots." This doesn't mean that Christians must accept Jesus as merely one bodhisattva among many. That would fail to honor the unique claims Christianity makes about Christ. But a Buddhist can look at the life of Jesus and recognize bodhisattva activity. Jesus approaches the sick. He touches those whom society considers unclean. He eats with people who've been rejected. He challenges religious hypocrisy. He speaks on behalf of the poor. He forgives enemies. He accepts suffering rather than answering violence with violence. From a Buddhist perspective, these are the actions of great compassion. They resemble the activity of Avalokiteshvara, the one who hears the cries of the world and responds in whatever form is necessary. Seen in this way, the Nativity becomes the story of compassion entering time. It becomes the story of boundless love accepting limitation. The infinite appears as an infant. The one who'll teach others becomes completely dependent upon others. The one who'll offer shelter must first be sheltered. The one who'll feed the hungry must first be fed. There's something deeply humbling in this. We often imagine spiritual power as invulnerability. We want awakening to make us untouchable. We want practice to free us from need, grief, uncertainty, and dependence. But the Nativity presents a different image. It shows us sacredness appearing with independence. It shows us compassion, accepting the risks of embodiment. Christmas, then, can be contemplated as a celebration of bodhisattva activity appearing in human history, not because Christianity and Buddhism are secretly the same, but because both traditions understand that love must become action. Compassion that never becomes embodied remains only an idea. Incarnation and emptiness. Christianity teaches that the divine Logos becomes flesh. The transcendent enters the conditions of human life. God becomes someone who can hunger, weep, suffer, rejoice, love, and die. Buddhism teaches that all phenomena are empty. But emptiness doesn't mean that nothing exists. It doesn't mean that life is meaningless or unreal. Emptiness means that nothing exists independently. Everything arises through relationship. Because things are empty of fixed essence, they're capable of change. Because they're empty, they can appear in infinite forms. The Heart Sutra tells us, form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. Emptiness isn't somewhere behind the world of form. It isn't a hidden spiritual substance. It's the true nature of form itself. A flower is empty because it contains the sun, rain, soil, air, time, and the entire history of the universe. A person is empty because no person exists independently of parents, culture, language, food, breath, relationships, and countless causes and conditions. Here we can hear a subtle resonance between incarnation and emptiness. For Christians, God becomes human out of love. For Buddhists, emptiness takes form continuously. Compassion can appear anywhere because no form is fixed or self-contained. Zen teacher Kon Yamada once suggested that the incarnation could be read as the great compassion of the universe, taking a shape that human beings can meet face to face. This isn't a claim of doctrinal agreement. It's an existential resonance. Human beings often need compassion to become visible. We need it to have a face. We need it to speak in a voice we can hear. We need it to touch the untouchable and sit beside the forgotten. In Mahayana Buddhism, Avalokiteshvara takes form according to need. In Christianity, divine love takes form in Jesus. The metaphysical explanations aren't the same. But the spiritual movement has a recognizable similarity. Compassion refuses to remain distant. It enters the conditions of suffering. Contemplating the Nativity as a Buddhist practitioner. So, how might a Buddhist practitioner approach Christmas? We don't have to pretend to be Christian. We don't have to recite doctrines we don't believe, and we don't have to dismiss the season as something belonging entirely to another tradition. We can receive the Nativity as an invitation to contemplation. We might contemplate birth as the continuous arising of each moment. Every moment is new. Of course, every moment carries the consequences of what came before. But no moment is merely a repetition of the past. This breath has never happened before. This sound has never been heard in precisely this way. This encounter will never occur again under exactly the same conditions. To practice Zen is to become intimate with this constant birth. We sit still enough to notice that reality is never still. Thoughts appear, sensations appear, sounds appear, emotions appear. Entire worlds are born and vanish within a single period of zazen. We might contemplate incarnation as the embodiment of compassion in our own actions. It isn't enough to admire compassion. It isn't enough to read about Avalokiteshvara or Jesus. Compassion must become flesh in us. It must become the phone call we've been avoiding, the meal we prepare, the apology we offer, the boundary we establish, the hand we extend, the silence in which we truly listen. We might contemplate the Christ child as the ever-new possibility of awakening. A child hasn't yet built the layers of identity that adults carry. A newborn doesn't know social rank, race, nationality, wealth, poverty, success, or failure. Those distinctions will be taught later. The child simply appears. Of course, Buddhism doesn't teach that children are automatically enlightened, but the image of the child can remind us of beginner's mind. It can remind us of openness. It can remind us that the world isn't exhausted by what we think we already know. We might contemplate Mary as the great receptivity of mind. Mary receives what she can't fully understand. She allows something sacred to develop within her. She bears uncertainty, danger, and transformation. From a Buddhist perspective, she may symbolize the receptive mind that gives birth to bodhicitta. Bodhicitta begins when we become open enough to receive the suffering of the world without turning away. We don't create compassion through force. We make room for it. We allow it to grow. We protect it until it's strong enough to enter the world. We might contemplate Joseph as the supporting conditions that allow compassion to appear. In Buddhist teaching, no phenomenon arises through a single cause. Everything depends upon conditions, pratyaya. Joseph isn't the central figure in most nativity scenes, but his presence matters. He provides protection. He accepts responsibility. He supports a process he didn't initiate and may not fully understand. That's often what compassionate practice looks like. We don't always have to be the central figure. We don't have to receive recognition. Sometimes our role is to create the conditions in which healing can occur. Sometimes we offer transportation, money, time, patience, shelter, or simple reliability. These quiet conditions allow compassion to take birth. The Nativity can therefore become a meditation on dependent origination. No child is born alone. No act of compassion occurs independently. Mary, Joseph, Jesus, the shepherds, the animals, the travelers, the land, the food, and the shelter all belong to a network of relationships. The story is filled with interdependence. It can also become a meditation on non-duality. The sacred and the ordinary meet in a stable. The divine and the human aren't kept at a safe distance from one another. The holy appears among animals, laborers, travelers, and a family unable to secure proper lodging. The extraordinary appears within the ordinary. Love taking flesh. A Buddhist reading of the Nativity doesn't require us to accept Christian dogma. It also doesn't require us to reduce Christianity to a collection of Buddhist metaphors. Respectful dialogue allows Christianity to remain Christianity and Buddhism to remain Buddhism. We can acknowledge that the traditions have different metaphysical foundations. We can recognize that they describe salvation and liberation differently. We can admit that Christians and Buddhists won't interpret Jesus in the same way, and yet we can still meet within a shared longing. A longing for compassion, a longing for freedom from hatred, a longing for peace, a longing for a world in which the vulnerable aren't abandoned. At its heart, the Nativity proclaims that love can take flesh. Compassion can be born into a suffering world. The sacred can appear in vulnerability. Hope can arrive in circumstances that seem too small, too poor, or too ordinary to contain it. Buddhism affirms this truth in its own way. Awakening is possible. Compassion isn't merely an emotion, it's woven into our interdependence. Wisdom can arise in the middle of confusion. A bodhisattva can appear wherever suffering is found. Every moment offers the possibility of what we might poetically call a virgin birth, a pure arising of wisdom that isn't contaminated by our old habits, a compassionate response that isn't dictated by resentment, a moment of clarity that isn't merely a continuation of yesterday's confusion. We often assume that the past must determine what happens next. Because we've always reacted with anger, we assume we must react with anger again. Because we've carried a wound for many years, we assume we'll carry it forever. Because the world has known violence, we assume violence is inevitable. But Zen practice asks us to remain present at the place where the next moment is born. Right here, before the word is spoken, before the hand closes into a fist, before judgment hardens, before fear becomes hatred, there's an opening. There's a moment in which another response can be born. Shunryu Suzuki Roshi taught, each moment is the birth of a Buddha. To hear this deeply is to understand that awakening isn't confined to ancient India. Compassion isn't confined to Bethlehem. The sacred isn't limited to temples, churches, monasteries, scriptures, or distant ages. The birth is happening now. The question is whether we'll make room for it. Will we allow wisdom to be born in this mind? Will we allow compassion to take flesh in these hands? Will we allow peace to enter the world through this life? Perhaps that's one way a Buddhist can stand before the image of the Nativity. Not by pretending that our traditions are identical, not by arguing over whose sacred story is superior, but by becoming quiet enough to hear what the story is asking of us. Love has entered the world. Compassion has taken form. A child has been born. Now, what will be born through us? Gasso.